The first vampire did not rise from a grave in Transylvania. It was not staked through the heart, burned at the crossroads, or put to rest by a priest wielding a cross. The first vampire was not even a creature of the night. It was a document, a single page, inked in the year 1724, that did something no monster had ever done before. It convinced the entire Western world that vampires were real. That page was a report filed by an Austrian soldier named Michael Ranft, dispatched to the village of Medvedka in what is now Serbia. The village had a problem. Bodies were exhumed from local graves showing no decomposition. The skin had not rotted. The nails and hair had grown. In one case, a corpse named Peter Blagojevich was said to have returned 8 times after death, each time killing a neighbor by drinking their blood. Ranft wrote down every detail. He filed the report to Vienna, and Vienna, being a bureaucratic empire, archived the document and copied it. Then the copies were copied. Within 5 years, vampire narratives were spreading across Germany, France, and England faster than any plague. But here is the part that unsettles every historian who has dug through the archives. The official story says vampire panic was a product of peasant superstition and poor science. People did not understand decomposition. They saw bloat and called it blood. They heard rats in the walls and called it a demon. That explanation has been repeated so many times that it now passes for truth. But the evidence tells a different story. The evidence says the vampire legend did not bubble up from illiterate villages. It was manufactured by the most literate, bureaucratic, and medically advanced institutions of the 18th century. The first vampire was, in fact, a product of the Enlightenment. This is where Structure C begins its descent. Layer 1 is the surface answer, the one every documentary gives you. Vampires were a folk panic caused by ignorance of decomposition. Layer 2 is the contradiction. Why did the same decomposition appear in graveyards across Europe, but only one specific region produced vampire stories that ignited the continent? Why did the Ottoman Empire, which shared the same soil, the same climate, the same bodies, produce no vampire literature during the same period? Layer 3 is the mechanism. The answer sits not in the ground, but in the imperial census system. The Habsburg monarchy in the early 1700s was conducting a population survey of its newly acquired Serbian territories. Every village had to report causes of death. Every unexplained death required a statement. And the Austrian officials, trained in the rationalist tradition, demanded physical evidence, so they opened graves. And when they found bodies that had not decomposed as expected, they wrote reports. Those reports were not peasant rumors. They were government documents, signed by military surgeons, sent to the imperial capital. The vampire was not a ghost story. It was a spreadsheet error. By 1732, the term vampire had entered the German language through a series of official memoranda. The French philosopher Voltaire, who had never believed in supernatural beings, wrote an essay in 1764 dismissing vampires as a product of the disease of credulity. But by then the damage was done. The Enlightenment had created its own monster, a creature born not of witches or demons, but of ink, paper, and the compulsive need to classify everything. Now look at what happened next. The vampire did not stay a bureaucratic anomaly. It migrated from official records into literature within 30 years. In 1748, a Hungarian countess wrote to the Empress Maria Theresa, demanding an end to the practice of exhuming corpses. The requests, known as the Vampire Controversy, forced the Empress to issue a decree banning grave openings across her empire. The ban was a legal document. It was also the first time a major European power had acknowledged, in writing, the existence of vampires as a matter of administrative concern. By acknowledging the problem, the empire made it real. This is the pivotal moment most accounts miss. The vampire crossed from folklore into reality not because someone believed in it, but because someone tried to suppress it. The same logic governs modern censorship. A banned book is more powerful than a permitted one. A forbidden fact spreads faster than a sanctioned truth. The Habsburg decree, meant to stop vampire panic, instead confirmed to every subject in the empire that vampires were dangerous enough to require imperial intervention. The monster was now official. The crack in the rational worldview had grown wide enough for an entire mythology to pass through. Consider the timing. 1748 is the same year Johann Gottfried von Herder was born, the philosopher who would later argue that national identity is rooted in language and folk tradition. The vampire did not just spread as a story, it spread as a propaganda weapon. Protestant German states used vampire narratives to discredit Catholic burial practices, claiming that improper rites caused the dead to return. Catholic theologians responded by writing treatises proving that vampires were demons sent by God to punish sinners. The theological debate. published in Latin and German, reached every seminary and university in the Holy Roman Empire. By the time the French Revolution began, vampire literature had become a genre of its own, complete with classification systems, burial protocols, and celebrated cases. Now we reach the strangest layer of all. The vampire that conquered the world was not the Slavic folk creature, the one that drank blood to feed its family or protect its land. That vampire was territorial and often benevolent. It did not wander freely. It stayed near its grave and demanded respect from the living community. The vampire that spread across Europe was the undeath of the stranger, the one that came from the outside, carried strange diseases, and drained the life from innocent households. That version of the vampire did not exist in Balkan oral tradition. It was invented by Austrian bureaucrats who misread the local beliefs and imposed their own cultural fears onto them. This is the moment of dissent. The surface answer says, vampires were folk creatures misunderstood by science. The deeper truth says vampires were science itself, a product of the early modern state, the printing press, and the compulsion to document every deviance from normal. The folk believers knew their undead were part of the community. The rationalists could not accept that, so they turned the vampire into an enemy, a pathogen, a threat to be eliminated. And that version of the monster is the one we still inherit today. Here is the part that should feel personal. When you imagine a vampire, you do not imagine a Balkan neighbor who died unfairly and needs a funeral. You imagine a pale aristocrat, a stranger in a castle, a predator who moves silently through your city. You imagine a disease. You imagine an invader. The historical record shows that this image was not transmitted from peasant to intellectual. It was transmitted from imperial administrator to newspaper reader, then from novelist to filmmaker. Every time you picture Dracula, you are seeing the ghost of an Austrian census report. You are seeing the moment a rational society could not tolerate mystery and tried to classify every dead body into a category. The bodies that did not fit became monsters. The monster did not exist until the bureaucracy demanded an answer. Let the weight of that sink. The modern vampire is not a survivor of ancient superstition. It is a fossil of the Enlightenment's inability to accept that some things cannot be explained by documents and measurements. The first vampire report was meant to close a case. It opened one that has never been closed, and that open case is the reason the vampire still walks through our literature, our cinema, and our dreams. It is not the monster that refuses to die. It is the question that refuses to be answered. And questions that refuse to be answered will always eventually find new bodies to inhabit. In the next chapter, we descend deeper into the mechanics of this transformation. We will look at the specific reports, the names of the soldiers and surgeons who wrote them, and the precise way the folk vampire was translated into a literary monster. The answer changes everything you think you know about how stories spread and how they survive. But the question we must sit with now is this. If the first vampire was a document, and the document was written to explain unexplained death, then every monster you fear is just a question you have not yet translated into a solution. The question is not whether vampires exist. The question is what happens to a society when it tries to bury a mystery alive. The mystery always digs its way back to the surface. That is the mechanism. That is the engine of every enduring monster. But this descent does not stop at the 18th century. The vampire did not merely survive the Enlightenment, it outlived the empire that created it. By the 1800s, the creature had shed its bureaucratic skin and entered the blood of romantic poetry. Lord Byron, in 1813, wrote a fragment of a novel titled simply A Fragment. In it, a traveler named Augustus Darville dies under mysterious circumstances and returns, changed. Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, took that fragment and in 1819 published The Vampire. It was the first story to feature a vampire as an aristocratic predator who moves through high society undetected. Polidori had done something no folktale had ever done. He had made the vampire a member of the elite, a gentleman, a predator who did not lurk in graveyards, but dined at your table. The shift from peasant revenant to aristocratic seducer was not accidental. It reflected a deeper fear that ran through Europe after the French Revolution. The aristocracy had been overthrown in France, executed, driven into exile. But the surviving nobles returned in the Restoration period, and they brought with them the anxiety of the undead. Were they really dead? Had the revolution truly ended their power, or had they merely retreated, biding their time, waiting to drain the continent of its blood again? The vampire became a political allegory. The folk creature had been a neighbor, the literary vampire was a landlord, and the image stuck. Now consider the timing of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Published in 1897, the novel arrived at the peak of British imperial anxiety. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world, but its boundaries were porous. Trade routes brought goods, people, and diseases from every corner of the globe. The same routes that carried tea and silk also carried invisible threats. Cholera epidemics had swept through London in the 1830s and 40s. The concept of contagion had entered public consciousness. Stoker's Dracula was not a folk revenant. He was a vector. He came from the east, from the liminal space of the Carpathians, a region that was neither fully European nor fully Asian. He did not need to bite you. He only needed to touch you, to exchange fluids, to pass the curse. He was a sexually transmitted disease wrapped in a nobleman's cloak. The layer beneath that is even darker. Vampire fiction exploded in the same decades that eugenics movements were gaining scientific legitimacy. The fear of blood mixing, of racial contamination, of the aristocratic line being diluted by foreign influence was not a fringe obsession. It was central to European intellectual life. Francis Galton published Hereditary Genius in 1869. The word eugenics entered the English dictionary in 1883. Stoker was not writing in a vacuum. He was writing in a culture that had already mapped the world into racial hierarchies and was terrified of the boundaries dissolving. The vampire crossed every boundary. He was neither alive nor dead. He was neither man nor beast. He moved between nations, classes, and species. He was the embodiment of everything the Victorian mind could not classify. And the only way to stop him was to drive a stake through his heart, which was itself a violent act of reclassification. The body had to be pinned back into its category. But here is the twist that most analyses miss. The vampire's power did not come from his supernatural abilities. It came from his ability to be perceived as one of us. Dracula could walk through London unnoticed. He could converse in multiple languages. He could appear as a gentleman, a lawyer, a merchant. The threat was not that the monster was monstrous. The threat was that the monster could pass for normal, and that is the fear that survived the 19th century. It survived the collapse of empires, the rise of fascism, the spread of global media. The vampire who looks like you, who sounds like you, who lives next door, is the vampire that cannot be stopped by any stake, because you will never know where to drive the stake in the first place. This is the point where the descent reaches its final layer. The vampire was never a supernatural being. It was always a metaphor for the mechanism of othering. We create monsters to mark the boundaries of acceptable humanity. We define what we are by pointing at what we are not. And every culture invents its own vampire. Japan has the Kyuketsuki, creatures born from human jealousies. Africa has the Az, a vampire that takes the form of a firefly. The Philippines has the Aswang, a shapeshifter that feeds on fetuses and the sick. These are not the same creature with different names. They are entirely different fears dressed in similar skin. But the Western vampire, the one born from Austrian census forms and refined by romantic poets and Victorian novelists, is the only one that has achieved global dominance. And the reason is simple. It is the most efficient technology for exporting fear ever invented. One document in 1724 started a chain reaction that produced thousands of novels, hundreds of films, an entire genre of cultural production. That is not a supernatural phenomenon. That is a media ecology. The vampire was not a creature that discovered the printing press. The printing press created the vampire. And the vampire continues to exist because we keep feeding it new media. Every time you watch a vampire movie, read a vampire novel, or scroll past a vampire meme, you are participating in a process that began with a single page in a Serbian archive. You are clicking a link in a chain of transmission that has never been broken. Now pause and consider what that means. If the vampire is a media artifact, then the fear it generates is also a media artifact. The terror you feel when you watch a vampire scene is not a response to a real threat. It is a response to a narrative system that has been optimized over 3 centuries to trigger the oldest circuits in your brain, the fear of being consumed, the fear of the boundary between self and other dissolving, the fear of the one you love becoming a stranger. These are real fears, but the vampire does not cause them. The vampire is a container into which we pour them, and the container has become so powerful that we forget it is a container. We think we are afraid of the monster. We are actually afraid of the shape the monster gives to our own unresolved dread. That is the deepest truth of the descent. The vampire is not a creature of the night. It is a creature of the archive, the printing press, the movie screen, the streaming platform. It is a pattern that learned to replicate itself across every medium it encountered, and the pattern will continue to replicate as long as we have bodies that decay, boundaries that blur, and societies that cannot tolerate mystery. The vampire is not the undead. The vampire is the unsolved, and the unsolved never dies. And consider the most recent mutation of this pattern. In the early 2020s, a new kind of vampire emerged, not in literature or cinema, but in the digital social sphere. Creators on platforms like TikTok began adopting what they called vampire aesthetics: pale skin, darkened lips, a languid gaze. But the aesthetic was not the content. The content was a narrative of exhaustion. Creators described themselves as energy vampires, people who felt drained by social interaction, who needed solitude to recharge, who were misunderstood by a world that demanded constant performance. The comment sections filled with thousands of people saying, "This is me." The vampire had not become a monster again. It had become an identity, and that is the final mutation. The folk vampire was a neighbor who demanded respect. The literary vampire was an aristocrat who preyed on the innocent. The cinematic vampire was a disease vector, but the digital vampire is a diagnosis. It is a label you give yourself to explain why the world feels exhausting, why your energy depletes faster than others, why you do not fit into the rhythms of a society that never sleeps. The vampire has been internalized. It is no longer something that comes for you. It is something you are. And that internalization is the most powerful form the pattern has ever taken, because now the vampire is no longer a threat to be eliminated. It is a self to be explored. It is a community to be joined. It is a way of being that gives structure to otherwise formless anxiety. The same mechanism that turned a bureaucratic document into a global myth has now turned a myth into a psychological category. The pattern has learned to inhabit the human mind directly, without the need for graves or castles or even a printed page. It lives in the way you describe yourself to strangers. It lives in the language you use to justify your solitude. It lives in the aesthetic choices you make to signal that you are different, that you are apart, that you are not like the others who do not understand the weight of being awake in a world that wants you to sleep. And the strangest part is that this internalization is not a distortion of the original pattern. It is the logical endpoint. The first vampire document was a tool for classification. A dead body did not fit the official category, so the category was expanded to include the vampire. Now, a living person does not fit the official category of normal social functioning, so the category is expanded again. The vampire is not a monster that violates categories. The vampire is a category violation that learned to speak, and it has been speaking for 300 years, adapting its language to whatever medium would carry its voice: the archive, the book, the film, the screen, the mind. This means the vampire will never die, because the need to classify what does not fit will never die. As long as there are bodies that decompose too slowly, minds that think too differently, lives that do not conform to the template, there will be a vampire to contain the anomaly. The vampire exists because we need it to exist. It is the shadow cast by the very act of making sense. So when you next feel the chill of a night scene in a film, or the pull of a story about a pale stranger, or the strange comfort of calling yourself an energy vampire, remember what you are touching. You are touching a thread that runs back through 3 centuries of media, through 100,000 printed pages, through the bureaucracy of a dead empire to a single grave in Serbia, and a man who needed to explain why the dead had not yet learned to stay dead. The thread is still live. It is still transmitting, and the question is no longer whether the vampire is real. The question is whether you can feel the pulse of the pattern moving through you, shaping the way you see yourself, your neighbors, your fears, your desires. The vampire is not watching you. The vampire is writing you, and it has been writing you since the first page was inked. Now look at the bodies in your own life, the people you call draining, the relationships you call toxic, the parts of yourself you call dark. Every one of them follows the same template. Something does not fit. Something refuses to stay in its assigned category. And the only tool you have inherited is the one the Austrian bureaucrats used. Label it, contain it, drive a stake through it. But the stake never works. The pattern always returns, because the pattern is not in the grave. The pattern is in the act of labeling itself, and the act of labeling will never stop as long as there is something that resists being named. That is the open thread. That is the question that has no answer. If the vampire is the pattern of classification, and the pattern is part of how you think, then every attempt to kill the vampire is an attempt to kill a part of yourself. And the part of yourself that resists classification will always survive. It will adapt. It will find a new medium. It will speak through your fear, your art, your identity, your dreams. The vampire is not the enemy. The vampire is the boundary you cannot hold. And the boundary you cannot hold is the only thing that keeps you from being fully known. And the boundary you cannot hold is the only thing that keeps you from being fully known. That is the secret that every archive, every empire, every rational system has tried to bury. You cannot classify a human being into a closed case. Every time you try, the body resists. The story resists. The question digs its way back to the surface. The vampire is that resistance given a name, and the name has become more powerful than any of the things it was meant to contain. The first vampire was a document. The last vampire will be a silence, not the silence of a buried secret, but the silence of a category that finally learned to understand that some things cannot be written. And in that silence, the only sound you will hear is the question that has never stopped asking itself, the question that refuses to be answered, the question that has no stake, no grave, no final page, the question that lives in the space between what you know and what you cannot bear to know. And that question, in the end, is the only true, undead. It has no beginning, it has no end, and it will never, ever stop walking.